Khan Shi Kiawao, Kirsten Merldisha Nikashon, a Miskwisi Wisgayakin Newakin, Duck Lake Batash Dushin, Ni Parenti, a Latond, a Paranto, a Unfa Michifnia. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kirsten Merle, and I am very pleased to be your moderator for today's session. I live in what is colonially known as Edmonton, and my ancestors and my family are from the Duck Lake and Batoche area of Saskatchewan. I am a Métis woman and a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and my family names are Latondra and Pronto. So I introduced myself to you in my ancestral language of Michif. Before we start today's discussion, I would like to start with a smudge. So for those of you that may be new to smudging, I'm going to give a little bit of context, and then I'm going to smudge myself, and then I will offer a smudge to you. So smudging in Indigenous culture is ceremony. It's a way that we not only cleanse ourselves, but it's also when we light our medicine and the smoke is carried up. The smoke can carry our prayers and our blessings to Creator. So I'm going to share with you what has been passed on to me, recognizing that smudging may differ from nation to nation, but what's been passed on to me is from a knowledge keeper here in Alberta, from a Métis knowledge keeper that has gifted me this knowledge. Something to consider if you do want to participate. Again, this is not mandatory, but if you do, I would encourage you to remove any glasses or any hats that you may be wearing. That's traditionally part of the ceremony, just to ensure that you have that connection with the medicine that I'm going to offer you. As Pauline had mentioned, no photography. Again, as this is considered ceremony, we don't want to have any recordings of it. And again, it's really unique to yourself and what you feel comfortable with. As I said, I'm going to share with you the smudging that I give to myself before I offer it to you, because I want to make sure that I'm cleansed before I'm offering any medicine to you all. But if you don't feel comfortable in terms of the idea of cleansing yourself or whatever your beliefs may be, I would encourage you to think about how we're connected here. So we use that phrasing in our teachings so often in terms of connection and all our relations. And we don't just mean human to human. We mean to Mother Earth. We mean to the 7 generations that will be coming after us and those that came before us. All of our winged friends, our other two-legged friends, furry friends, the insect nation. So think of how your connection to that, because I think that will really help put us in a good place as we enter these discussions today. With that, I am very pleased to introduce our panelists. So a larger description or bio of each of them should be available on your console. And I'll share a few words about them though today before we get into our roundtables. So first of all, we have Sheldon Baikie. He is an Indigenous civil engineer from Northwest River, Labrador, and a proud beneficiary of the Nunatsiavut Lands Agreement. He now works as asset management lead with Newfoundland Power and lives in St. John's. He has been engaged in a number of volunteer committees, including the National Engineering and Geoscience Month Committee of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Newfoundland and Labrador, and more recently became involved with the Indigenous Advisory Committee of Engineers Canada and WISE NL's Women in Science and Engineering Newfoundland and Labrador Indigenous STEM Youth Gathering. So welcome, Sheldon. Next, we have Kaella-Marie Earle. Kaella is Ojibwe, Odawa, and Bowdawatomi from Wequemcong unceded territory and Arrowland First Nation. She works as a professional engineer at Enbridge in hydraulic system design for liquid pipelines and storage. She serves as vice chairperson of the Indigenous Advisory Committee of the Canada Energy Regulator, working with a team of Indigenous leaders to advise the board of directors on building strategy for the inclusion of Indigenous people in energy, as well as the implementation of UNDRIP. Her career foundation is to weave her Anishinaabe cultural views and values into her engineering work in a way that will lead the oil and gas industry to a lower carbon and more just energy future, especially in frontline operations. And our third panelist is Keith Diakiw. He is a professional Métis geologist and GEO, Geo Experience Officer of Talking Rock Tours, which is the world's first geo-educational adventure company that is 100% Indigenous owned and operated. Talking Rock Tours provides discovery tours that highlight the natural and cultural history of the geological wonders of Alberta through an Indigenous cultural lens. Keith also works as the Northern Environmental Coordinator for the Canadian Army. In 2021, Keith was elected as board member of Indigenous Tourism Alberta and selected as the Indigenous liaison for the Interpretive Guides Association. Welcome, Keith. So with that, I would love to move into our very first roundtable question. And Kaella, I am going to pose this to you first. So the first question that we have, from your perspective, what does meaningful engagement look like for engineering and geoscience professionals working in areas where engagement is a requirement and or a leading practice?
Miigwech for the introduction. Bojo Gakanawea. Hello, everyone. Wasia Indigenous. My Anishinaabe name is Wasia, which means bright light. Just wanted to let you know a couple things about me. So for me, and I expect the soon-to-be laws and regulations in energy, and I also expect mining, meaningful, the phrase meaningful is more than what the status quo of engagement has looked like in recent years. And also, I just want to quickly note that I'm speaking from an Ontario context and that I actually think Alberta is way ahead of Ontario, but that generally across Canada, engagement practices need to catch up with law. And I know that's a really intense thing to say, especially to engineering professionals, because, you know, obviously much of our profession is based on case law. But Canada and provinces are getting sued for not honoring treaties and other Crown Indigenous nation agreements and losing billions in the process, not only in legal fees, but also in what nations end up getting in retroactive payments and reparation for injustice. So from there, I want to highlight that new laws require free and prior informed consent, according to Bill C-15, aligning Canadian law with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the according action plan measures listed in the UNDA Action Plan, released by the Department of Justice last year. So in the spirit of that document and those requirements, departments such as Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Canada Energy Regulator, and other federal families that have a profound impact on our work as engineers all have actionable responsibilities that you can see if you look at the document, have very specific departments listed as accountable. And for anyone who's in the regulatory space, I'm sure many of you are as engineering professionals, a lot of the time the Crown, like the agents of the Crown, will often pass on some of those responsibilities to proponents. So if you're working at an energy company or a mining company, sometimes those responsibilities fall onto us. So where do we go from there? So meaningful engagement then, after all of that, looks like calling engineering professionals to be brave. So obviously our highest value is safety of the public, which means we must know what's going on in communities and nations. We must uphold a growth mindset in ourselves, which means always staying open to learning. We must make every effort to ensure people adequately understand what we're doing. And we must make every effort to ensure the rights holders, stakeholders, and subject matter experts are included in design and execution processes. And we must use everything that we learn to act. So meaningful engagement then looks like Indigenous people in leadership positions at energy proponents. It looks like technical professionals holding relationships with First Nation people after attending powwows every year. It looks like people in the community knowing the engineers designing and performing work and understanding the content. It looks like listening to the people to ensure our work aligns with their safety. it's really not that complex. It's really just about building, our professional relationship with Indigenous people, and every single engineer knows about HAZOPs and PHAs and understanding how we got to a significant problem, and that's another part of our duty as engineers. These are all part of the material and what it takes in order for us to really ensure that the public is safe. So it's really similar as what we'd expect everywhere else, but also different in that it's required by law and Indigenous people hold unique rights. So have we done that? No. A good example of significant engineering failure to uphold the safety of the public can be seen clearly in places like Grassy Narrows and Amjunong First Nation. So in Chemical Valley, Sarnia, Ontario, failing to meaningfully engage in the work that we do as engineers to uphold the safety of the public has resulted in people dying. A lot of First Nation people dying in Ontario, or sick, or extreme levels of injustice. So that's I'll end there.
Thank you, Kaella. I think some of the words that connected with me that you just shared was free and prior consent, spirit of documents, brave, safety of the people, learn to act, and holding relationships and listening. So thank you for that. I'll ask Sheldon now the same question. So again, from your perspective, Sheldon, what does meaningful engagement look like for engineering and geoscience professionals?
Nakomik, thank you very much. My name is, and I'll just do a quick introduction as well. My name is Sheldon Baikie. My pronouns are he, him. And I did grow up in Northwest River, Labrador, just outside the boundaries of the Inuit land claim. And I grew up on the lands of the Innu people. I'm currently working as a civil engineer in physical asset management. I reside in St. John's, Newfoundland. And this is the lands of the Beothuk people who are no longer with us, and also the Mi'kmaq. I'm humbled and very thankful to be here today to talk about this. And I think Kaella mentioned a number of very important things that I want to reiterate. And I guess the first one is the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, and ensuring that communities and community, that free, prior, and informed consent and the concepts with UNDRIP are adhered to, and that is law of the country now. So we have to make sure that that is enacted. And I think even further to that, I think Kaella also mentioned it a little bit as well, is the word relationships. And that's something from my experience as an engineer, and previously I was a government administrator in Labrador. I worked for provincial government, but I also worked for Nunatsiavut government as well, the Inuit government. And one thing that I know we valued from consultants, engineers, anyone that we would be looking for help from, is relationships with us. So, we wanted people, we needed help in certain areas, and we wanted people who were willing to listen and understand what our value systems were, and also to listen and understand what was important to us. And it's not just a one-time thing. I mentioned, and Kaella as well, the word relationships. That needs to be sustained long-term, not just one project and done. I'll say it needs to be a much longer-term commitment by the engineering profession, whether that be a consultant or a company or something of that nature. And I think, one example I'll quickly give of something that has worked really well in my experience, that I've known that has done really well, is the Voisey's Bay mine site in Nunatsiavut, or in northern Labrador. they were involved as well as the Innu in the environmental assessment terms of reference. So not just involved in the terms of reference, but not just involved in the environmental assessment, but also the terms of reference and how that was going to be evaluated. So that's really important to get involved right at the start and have a relationship. Out of that came numerous things that I think has happened all over the country, IBAs. And then one of the main things that came out of that was winter ice travel was identified as something that was very important for the Inuit. And the mine required shipping all year round. But it led to an Inuit-led consultant coming up with an engineered solution to help when boats come in. I guess it's a bridge that actually gets installed when the ice doesn't freeze soon enough after a ship comes in for deliveries into the mine. So very innovative solutions and community-led solutions that, work for everyone. So I think that's the type of thing we're looking for when we're talking about meaningful engagement.
Great, thank you so much, Sheldon. Again, some of the items that you shared that really connected was relationships, but long-term relationships, that importance of maintaining them, developing and maintaining them, as well as the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge for problem solving, and the community-led solutions. So thank you. So Keith, we'll ask you the same question. From your perspective, what does meaningful engagement look like?
Abawaste, Onse, Oki, Tanche, and hello and bonjour everyone across Canada. It's such an honor to be here today, and Marcy to Kirsten to lead us off in a good way with the smudge. It's so important, as you know, for APEGA, we don't have a lot of Indigenous professional members, so being a part of this panel is so meaningful, and to kind of share the knowledge that we've been gifted and to share that with you all today. Now, with my esteemed colleagues, what I like to share fundamentally, right, it always starts with us, right? Like when you're ever in an emergency situation, you gotta, don on the oxygen mask, when you look at that plane analogy before helping others. So in the realm of Indigenous ways of knowing, one must begin each day with a good heart, along with good intentions for our everyday interactions with family, friends, and of course, when we go to work for the business activities. And really true engagement is, more than just lip service or cookie cutter type of land acknowledgements. Really, it has to, come from the heart, and we need to walk together more than ever due to the large scale challenges of the world. Like when you think of climate change, when you think of plastic and PFAS pollution, and when you think of what my esteemed colleagues were talking about with the legal requirements, it's more than just due diligence of which boxes to check, what things need to come next just to, protect ourselves from a liability standpoint. It's really having, the proper intent and to walk in a good way. And really to build quality relationships with Indigenous people, one must put the time and effort, to give proper protocol, to create those meaningful conversations like in person, right? I'm kind of old school. It's kind of weird for me to do presentations because, as you know, with me being a tour operator, I love that personal connection with being on the land with people. In this virtual setting, it's kind of, unusual, but still important to kind of share, that knowledge, right? And to build those relationships, because I find in today's business, in my opinion, it's more transactional more than ever. It's all about what do you do? What can you do for me? Let's make money together. And it really should be, those social components. Like, yes, we go into business to make a profit so that we can stay afloat, but there's just so many more meaningful layers of, day-to-day activities and that legacy piece and the social good that comes with doing good things. And I guess one of the examples to kind of highlight, like with Sheldon talking about Boise Bay, for me, when I went through, the event that shall not be named, i.e. COVID-19, I was kind of recruited for a geotechnical job in the middle of Northwest Ontario. And what I found very special about that project, the Watay transmission project, is it was, you know, one of the biggest types of projects in all of the history of Ontario, maybe even Canada, for its size and scale, being Indigenous led. And, you know, it's basically, as the word for the project, it's like the line that will bring light. And it blew my mind, you know, when you think when I started this job in 2021, that there is still, because I knew about the potable water issues with many of the reserves of Canada, but what really blew me away was, you know, there is still individuals, you know, cousins that are living in Ontario that everything is powered by diesel generators. And that this Watay project, being 51% owned with that partnership with Fortress, and, you know, this multi-year, multi-billion-dollar kind of project, is to install 1,800 kilometers of transmission line to essentially connect, you know, 17 remote communities. And it was real an honor to be, you know, it wasn't true geology, right? It was like geotechnical test pits. But what I found very amazing about that project is how the elders were properly consulted, and how, you know, in the business plan and the acts of, you know, day-to-day business was essentially all workers that disrupt with the test pit of Mother Earth, that they need to give proper protocol with a pinch of tobacco and say miigwech, which is thank you in Ojibwe, and to honor, you know, Creator, to honor Mother Earth with that simple act of respect. And before any of the test pits were basically backfilled, for every single transmission tower line. So you can imagine 1,800 kilometers, that's a lot of test pits. But when I was on the scene and there was other coworkers, they're like, I don't know why we have all this tobacco, and they didn't really fully understand it. Of course, the smokers are like, oh, great, I can get some extra tobacco out of this. But it was just that opportunity to educate others that are blue collar and white collar workers why it's important to do the right thing and to follow proper protocols.
Great, thank you, Keith. You know, something that stood out with what you shared to me was the proper consultation of elders and using that proper protocol, and how that connects to the meaningful engagement, as well as Indigenous ways of knowing, walking together, but also walking together in a good way. So thank you for that. We'll move on to our next question. And Sheldon, I'm going to ask you this one first. So Sheldon, based on your own experience, how can the professions bring together Indigenous perspectives and knowledges within STEM, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, within STEM fields, to foster meaningful collaboration among Indigenous and non-Indigenous professionals? If you have any examples, please share what you have seen from your own career journey that had an impact.
Thank you. I think this is something that I'm very passionate about, and, you know, it certainly has, you know, I'm involved in a number of the volunteer things that I'm involved with because I have, you know, a fire to foster meaningful collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous professionals. And it's sort of, you know, one of the reasons I'm involved with Engineers Canada. I think one of the main things, you know, that has been talked about and that we've discussed around the Indigenous Advisory Committee is training, and, you know, mandatory training for ongoing development hours for professionals of, you know, not just Indigenous, but all professionals. We're seeing a lot of EDI and ethics, you know, courses and teachings growing in terms of those development hours. But I think specifically what we need is truth and reconciliation learning identified in some of these trainings. I think one example of that would be, you know, the 4 seasons is...
Sheldon.
Yeah.
Sorry, my apologies. I believe your camera isn't turned on. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but if you don't mind just checking your camera. There we go. You were at 4 seasons.
Okay, sorry, is good now?
Yes, it's good now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so one of those would be the Four Seasons, is a very good program that I know, like, for example, my organization had provided to all employees to avail of. So I think that was a very positive thing. I think forums like this are great as well for sharing and collaboration. I think one of the main things that we've also been looking to work on is outreach and mentorship programs for Indigenous professionals. And that could be other Indigenous professionals as well, and mentors that may be Indigenous or non-Indigenous, but encouraging Indigenous professionals to progress through their careers. I think we talk about truth and reconciliation as well. It is for everyone. I'm not sure everyone in Canada realizes that yet. Indigenous, non-Indigenous alike, we need to work and progress truth and reconciliation. And I think the first part, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission laid bare everything that has happened, not everything, but a large amount of what has happened to Indigenous peoples. But I think individually, collectively, as a society, we have to recognize that truth. And that means personally and whatever profession that might be. So I think, though, to get that understanding, for example, of the way the railway would have expropriated land, or the flooding of traditional homelands for a hydroelectric development. Those things happened, and people need to understand that engineering, and was a part of that. Science was a part of that, and we have to acknowledge the truth in, and we see this throughout other not industries, but we see it in the healthcare sector, that they're acknowledging the truth. And I think we have to do that in the science and technology field as well. And that will help non-Indigenous people understand that history and the current situation and where we go in the future.
Thank you, Sheldon. So again, some of the topics that you shared that really stood out was, calling for mandatory training, having outreach and mentorship opportunities, the reminder that truth and reconciliation is for everyone. And I think part of that starts, as you noted, was the acknowledgement of the truth in science and technology. So thank you for that, Sheldon. Keith, I'm going to ask you next. So again, based on your own experience, how can the professions bring together Indigenous perspectives and knowledges within STEM?
Marcy. Just to kind of highlight, the last time I was introduced there, some of the Indigenous languages, like I'm here based in Amiskwaciy-Waskagan, Beaver Hills House, known today as Edmonton, but it's also good to honor the First Peoples. So when I said hello in Stoney Nakoda, that was Abaweste, and I also said Tantse, which is Nehewak for hello, and then I said Oki, which is Nisitapi, and then Tantse, which is, of course, Michif for hello. So it's always good to be introduced to language and then also kind of reinforce that, throughout this session. That kind of one of my calls to action, kind of leading up with our last question, is if there's a word that we share today that resonates with me, because my favorite word for thank you is miigwech. Use that in your everyday vocabulary instead of saying thank you. Or the next time you take a family picture, instead of saying cheese or fromage, right, say miigwech, right, just to honor the people that came before us. Now, to answer the question, right, Sheldon did a great job, especially with, the TRC and the 94 calls to action, because again, it was big media coverage, right? And I'm assuming many Canadians kind of don't have it in front of mind. And it's almost like, for me as an Indigenous person and also leading Indigenous tours, what's also kind of shocking is how many calls to action have actually been satisfied, which is like, less than 20, and how many more to go. And from my experience, like from a professional standpoint, right, I've been, in the realm of geology since my first summer job, kind of like 92, 93, all the way to 2017 for geology. But what I'd like to kind of highlight, when I was, taking geology at the University of Alberta, I joined the Naval Reserve. And, being a proud member of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Department of National Defense is doing great things to be more inclusive. And one of those things that I've seen since I joined in 2001 to now being full-time on a 3-year contract, kind of halfway through that right now as the Northern Environmental Coordinator, is there's actually defense advisory groups. And they basically, the mandate is to kind of create employment equity objectives and enhance diversity across the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. So that literally senior leadership from the CDS all the way to, the colonel here at CFB Edmonton have a resource to do the right thing and incorporate, events and cultural celebrations to highlight the diverse membership base of the Canadian Armed Forces. And like for myself, being a proud Michif, a proud Métis, I'm a member of the DIAG, which is the Defense Indigenous Advisory Group. So there's even national, regional, and local bodies. And we just had, 3 events last month for Indigenous Awareness Week. So you can see something like when I did basic training back in 2001, it wasn't even talked about, right? You just suck it up. That's just how it is, to now being very inclusive and welcoming. Because you probably know in the media, right? The Canadian Armed Forces, like all businesses, probably in all sectors, are short people. And, how do we retain and do things in the right way? And that's basically being more inclusive and walking in a good way. And it really creates that ripple effect because, I didn't learn about residential schools when I went to K to 12. I had no idea about the Trail of Tears for our cousins to south of the Medicine Line until I was actually an Indigenous tour operator. I had no idea. So it's all of this learning that's yet to be done. We just have to, put ourselves out there and join, organizations that are forward thinking and being proactive and retaining top talent because you're doing the right things. And another thing that's really great as a shout out to the Canadian Armed Forces is they even have programs now. They're 6 weeks in length. We're not quite, the full 11 weeks that I did basic training. But there's programs like the Bold Eagle that's at a CFB Wainwright. So it's a 6-week course where it's all Indigenous recruits that essentially, learn the ins and outs of traditional culture, because many, are not taught this at home, right? Sadly, from that legacy of residential schools. So it's just a way to build community from the fragments and to give people a taste of, self-discipline, self-respect, self-confidence. And then that leads to potentially maybe a rake force job down the road. So you can see with the government of Canada, with those black guys of Canadian history in the past, are now actually stepping up the plate and doing things in a good way. And obviously, there's a lot of healing from things that have happened in the past, and other organizations need to literally jump on and be a part of this wave of change.
Thank you, Keith. Again, some key notes that I took down while you were sharing was, I loved that suggestion of using language to honor those who were here before us. So thank you for sharing that with us. I also wrote down, highlight your diverse workforce. And that's going to be connected to that retaining your talent because you are doing the right thing. So thank you. Kaella, I will ask the same question to you. You can finish us out on this question. So I'll just share it with you again. Based on your own experience, how can the professions bring together Indigenous perspectives and knowledges within STEM, so that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, within those STEM fields to foster meaningful collaboration among Indigenous and non-Indigenous professionals?
Great, Miigwech, for that question. Yeah, so to provide a little bit of context, my experience is pretty deeply field-based. I spent 2 years in a mining industrial space and have now been in oil and gas for 5 years, primarily leading projects in transmission and storage expansion and pipeline integrity and natural gas, and now hydraulic design for liquid commodities. I've also designed strategies for the elimination of planned vented methane emissions in transmission projects and operations. So a lot of construction and operation context in some of the following that I'm about to say. I also often like to rant about energy regulation because I've been working with the leadership team at the Canada Energy Regulator for the last 4 years. So with that being said, one of the first things I want to mention is the IAMCs. So some of you in the crowd might know what an IAMC is. They're an Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee. Essentially, what they do right now is there's one for Enbridge Line 3 and another one for TMX. And essentially, they are a team of Indigenous technical professionals that have built up an exceptional level of capacity, and they monitor the work. They do environmental assessments. They participate in compliance verification activities, so CVAs. They're out in field learning about exactly what's happening, and they report that back to the nations along the right-of-way of the pipeline. And how I view the IAMCs is not only as this exceptional opportunity for proponents to learn more about, for example, environmental stewardship, which Indigenous nations are very advanced at, and the successful protection of culturally relevant spaces, because those experts are out on field teaching, construction crews and engineers about what's important to them and how to improve the way that they're executing. But IAMCs also result in more safe regulation in the direction of energy transition and act as a mechanism for consent. So they don't make decisions. I think both of them in their terms of reference have requirements to be non-prejudicial when it comes to whether or not a project goes forward. Their duties are to report the facts, kind of like a pipeline inspector. And there are pipeline inspectors. And they also actually do emergency management, which is so exceptionally critical right now, especially to me as an engineering professional, because, and I'm going to say this over and over again, safety is our primary and most highest value. And First Nation, Inuit, and Métis nations across Canada often have way less emergency management capacity, which means that the building of groups like IAMCs to be a more standard practice across energy and mining and even mobility projects in Canada and the US will absolutely result in better safety outcomes and less death in the case of any sort of catastrophe. So as engineering professionals, it is our primary responsibility and duty to make sure that we're supporting these sorts of things in the way that we approach our work. The next thing I want to talk about is respect practices. So in general, respect practices reduce non-technical risk and result in the maintenance of energy security. So basically what a respect practice is your team, your technical team, your engineers, your operators, your construction crews learn something like build up their capacity for cultural intelligence. And that results in standardized practices in field and with the way that designs are completed in order to respect the values of a specific culture. And so one example I'll provide on that, actually there's construction teams that I'm aware of have standard respect practices where they do a ceremony at the beginning of a construction project, and an elder comes out and they do some asema teachings, which is tobacco, just to get everybody aware of how critical it is to reduce the footprint of the work and really improve environmental stewardship practices. But I did a maintenance dig on a 16-inch transmission line years ago now. And basically, as part of the pre-environmental assessment, we had archaeologists out doing like early stage archaeological work. And a lot of Indigenous or First Nation archaeological professionals were out also engaged in that entire piece of the work. And I went out a number of times just to get to know people, my relatives, people who were, from the same areas as me. I wanted them to know me and make sure that I was made available to them and share my teachings on certain things. And it was a really good experience. But what ended up happening is the archaeological team uncovered a number of artifacts, including an ancestor and the ancestor's bundle, which was incredible. It was really unexpected, and that had never happened to our team before. And so these human remains that were there were found to be Anishinaabe or indigenous in nature because of the cultural items surrounding it. And that area was known to be a camp area for Anishinaabe. And so what I immediately did was I went out there and I said, what do you need from me to feel safe about the situation? And like, what cultural practices do you want me to follow? Because all nations, even if they're in the same province or in the same area, they probably have different protocols. And so they told me what they wanted, and I did it immediately. I was just like, okay, this area is fenced off. We have people protecting it. My boss was like freaking out. He called me. He's like, what do you want me to do? I'm like, just show up with coffee and snacks so everyone feels okay. And he did that. And we reacted pretty quickly, and it went very smoothly. Shortly after that, I facilitated a discussion between the nations, and they negotiated that one specific nation would repatriate the remains according to their cultural protocols. So our team paid and provided resources so that an elder could come out and do a ceremony on site and do some teachings. And my team came out, so all of my inspectors and contractors, I had them all come out, and I briefed them beforehand saying like, hey, this is an important cultural practice and relevant to this pre-environmental assessment, like, please be respectful. And everyone came out, and the elder did the ceremony and did some teachings. And then I sat on site for a couple of days with the elder and one of my pipeline inspectors, while one of the archaeologists was reinterring the remains into a cedar box. And I asked my construction crew if they could come out and help because some of the stuff was pretty heavy. And, in construction, for anyone who's worked in construction, like, no one's ever clean. Like, you're always basically a dirt ball. You're in a pipeline trench all day, whatever, muddy and stuff. So I'd never really seen these guys clean up. And they showed up in like pressed pants, like collared shirts, hair done back. And when they showed up, I cried. I was like, wow, these guys like really, understood that this was something that was important to the nation and wanted to demonstrate respect. And they helped the elder and the archaeologist and other First Nation people reinter the remains. And it went back to the First Nation where they had further ceremony and put it into their burial ground. And this was, after all of this was complete, it was over the course of like a couple of months. And the nation, one of the government folks of that nation ended up contacting me afterward and said it went so well that they hoped that we would standardize everything that happened. And so I've been sharing it as, a technical respect practice for other professionals where I work and pretty much everywhere. Because, for some context in the energy world and other worlds, and you see it, if you go in the news and learn about Bad River, you can see how bad conflicts can get. Billions of dollars lost, energy security risk to economic lifelines, like pretty significant levels of conflict, very, very expensive. There have been other cases where people enter into legal battles over this exact issue for 10 years. So to just have a little bit of cultural intelligence and sharing that with your team is going to result in the improvement of energy security, in the significant reduction of cost and non-technical risk to your work. It's such an important piece. Some other points I want to make is that Anishinaabe perspectives can enrich the approach of engineers in our pursuit of net zero. So many of you probably already know this, but Anishinaabe perspectives and other First Nation perspectives, and Anishinaabe, which means our laws, essentially always prioritize environmental stewardship, which is something that every single engineer, no matter what sector that you're working in, you really have a responsibility to turn into. So Anishinaabe perspectives and laws quite deeply understand right in our culture that safety and our safety is completely dependent on the safety of the land. We need water to live. We need land to maintain food security. We need air to reduce healthcare costs. All of these things. And so exactly what are we doing beyond, the bare minimum requirements of some regulation to reduce and eliminate some of these things, or enrich environmental areas to improve health and safety outcomes. And so oftentimes I talk, and I could talk so much about this, that our perspectives can help enrich ethics and morals that engineers have to comply with. Anishinaabe life cycle story. So there's a teaching that I received from an elder a few years ago that there's a life cycle, and everyone comes from Gjem, which is the Great Spirit, and in this circle. And when you are coming to this world, the Gjem, the Great Spirit, gifts you with Anishinaabe, the language, and the language has all the instructions to live a good life. And then you land on the earth as a baby, and you're still close to the creator. And as you age, you get farther away from the creator. And when you're middle-aged, you're the farthest away. And then as you get older and you become an elder, you get closer to the creator again, and then you die and you go back. And often what you'll see in governing systems is that there will be a governing system with counselors and governors and whatnot, but there's also typically a council of elders and youth. Because they are the closest to the creator. But from a more pragmatic perspective, obviously the inclusion of elders is good because they have, all the experience of a life well lived, and they have lots of wisdom. But when it comes to the inclusion of young people, I think often that's missed in the discussion on governance. And the unique opportunity that young people bring is that they're still so close to their values, and they're not they haven't been doing the same thing over and over. And so that they're blind to some of they won't see, they're not subject to the kind of complacency that might be inherent in professionals who have been doing the same thing for a long time. And so they'll see things and they'll be close to values, and they'll say, why are we doing it that way? Or why is it so complex? Or why is it said this way? What is the value here? And there's that having the fresh eyes review on the way that we approach our work is exceptionally valuable. It helps streamline things. It helps improve how close we are to our actual values and reminds us of our values. And so one example of that in my work is the inclusion of young professionals. So people who weren't even engineers yet, in recent design manual, helped find issues and processes that like I mentioned, other engineers might have been complacent to. It resulted in the changing of a lot of technical content to simplify it, which saves money and time and makes technical information more accessible, which is a critical component of free and informed consent. Okay, I've got 3 more things. Anishinaabe perspectives expand our understanding of safety as the safety of the land, which is something I've already mentioned, but I wanted to make the point that safety from the perspective of Anishinaabe and other First Nations is not just a hard hat or a lockout tagout or the prevention of injury, but rather the preservation of life. And what an incredible and enriching way to look at what safety culture is. And then the inclusion of Anishinaabe perspectives as normal will enrich safety outcomes. So one thing that's quite normalized in Anishinaabe communities is women in leadership, which is still a journey that I would say the engineering profession is on. I think a lot more women are in leadership in the technical spaces. But one thing that I'm not sure people think about is that statistically, women are 70 to 90% more likely to engage in mental health related help if they need it. and men are not. And men in Alberta are among the top 2 at most risk of suicide, single men in the trades. And so imagine if more women are in leadership positions in the front line, injecting that kind of culture into their teams, which are mostly men in the trades. This will absolutely result in better safety outcomes for the team. And then to end some of my perspectives on these, the inclusion of these perspectives will enrich our pre-existing values and result in improved safety outcomes for everyone. Ultimately, this is the most important duty of the engineer. And I'm designing a course on this right now, so if you follow me, or you might see me talk about that a bit more. But I'm designing an engineering course about this. Miigwech.
Well, we look forward to seeing more about that from you, Kaella. And what a beautiful, and I can only imagine emotional experience that you had with finding an ancestor. And thank you for sharing that with us, as well as how respectfully that situation was handled. I also thank you. I learned a new acronym today, the IAMC. I had not heard that before, so thank you for that. And the phrase respect practices. So just thank you for your answers to that question, Kaella. Now, we do have one more question for our roundtable. I'm wanting to be mindful of time because we do have some lovely questions coming in, and I recognize that we only have about 12 or 13 minutes here. So I'm going to make it really tough for our panelists. My next question is, I know it's what steps can educators, but I'm going to minimize that to singular. So I'm only going to ask for a single step, if you're able to do that, to answer this last question. And Keith, I will ask you to go first. So just again, if you can be a little bit mindful of time, so we have an opportunity to answer some of these questions. I'm going to ask you, what step can educators, professionals, and organizations take towards reconciliation for the engineering and geoscience professions broadly? And what can APEGA members do? So maybe you get to do 2. One step for organizations and one step for us as individuals, please.
Right, Marcy. And I guess it's good to share a quick heartwarming connectedness, right? Like with Kirsten and I, we're actually cousins, and with this event, it kind of brought us together. So in the spirit of Wekotowin and how we're all interconnected, it's an amazing beauty that comes with even professional events. So to quickly answer, kind of the $1 million question that lots of individuals and organizations that are basically looking for, from those levels. And it all begins with an open heart and an open mind, because you need to be willing to put yourself out there. Because even on my tours, I experienced that multiple times, that so many people want to be allies for Indigenous peoples, but they didn't want to offend, right? They are so unsure. But that's the biggest thing, is just, you can't make a mistake if your heart's in the right place. So put yourself out there. So from an individual, as an individual, an educator, and as a professional, really learn the history, the true history of Canada. Put yourself out there, learn the Black Eyes of Canadian history, from residential day schools to the 60s scoop, even the legacy pieces of the Indian Act that are still with us today, with reserves, missing and murder Indigenous women and girls and men and boys. And, as one elder said, there's no reconciliation without knowing the whole truth. So be empathetic and debunk many of the unfounded stereotypes when you overhear them in public. Be a true ally and actually speak up for our Indigenous cousins. And then from an organizational standpoint, be that agent of reconciliation you want to see in the world by publicly allowing your staff to attend, the red dress, red shirt day, like May 5th that happened, the Moose Hide campaign to wear Moose Hide over your heart on May 16th, National Indigenous Peoples Day coming up on June 21st, and Orange Shirt Day, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, on September 30th. So you can see, from an individual educator and professional standpoint, it's really easy to start. It's literally the advice my parents gave, basically the sooner you buy a house, the better. And in this regard to reconciliation, the sooner you actually put yourself out there and learn, the better you become, and then be that agent of change, right? The knowledge is literally the pebble. You are that agent of change. And for organizations, right, you just have to think big picture and get the ball rolling for your staff.
Thank you so much. And thank you for probably shortening your answer at my request last minute. Sorry, Kaella, I'll ask you the same question. What step can educators or organizations take towards reconciliation? And then as well, what can an individual do?
Yeah, for sure. Miigwech for the question. Okay, educators, we need more recruitment directly in First Nations. You spend not enough time going directly to First Nations and engaging directly with them to recruit students. So get out there. Professionals, this was already said a little bit, but stay open and learn some things. The University of Alberta Indigenous Canada course is fantastic. There are some good podcasts like Thunder Bay by Canada Land and also Finding Cleo. They're really good resources for learning about injustice that First Nation people face. Read about Grassy Narrows, about Airland First Nations fight against the Ring of Fire in Ontario, and about Anjunong and the resulting moratorium that Environment and Climate Change Canada just released on benzene emissions. These are all heavily relevant to us as engineers. Go to powwows, engage in local activities led by First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. If there aren't any Indigenous leaders where you are, ask why and advocate for them. Sponsor a young Indigenous professional engineering. Stay open to collaboration when it comes to communicating what you're doing on a project at work with Indigenous engagement and start building those relationships. Learn about treaties and unique laws because we are part of them, and the government is paying a lot of money because they keep losing in the Supreme Court against those things. All these actions will result in less risk to your work. I promise you that. Organizations, challenge the bias you probably have that Indigenous professionals don't exist. They absolutely do. There's lots of us now, so don't be afraid to act outside your normal hiring practices and engage with Indigenous recruitment corporations like Leadership International and others to get Indigenous people in your executive team, in your boards, and in leadership positions right from frontline supervision to directorship. It's inappropriate in this day and age for non-Indigenous people to be taking up leadership space on Indigenous engagement portfolios at essentially every organization. That would be like me, an Anishinaabe woman, leading a portfolio about engaging with Black communities. I do not have that lived experience or history. So please question why we allow that in proponents and organizations. It really is, in the end, a lost opportunity to do everything I've already said, reduce non-technical risk to your work, engage in a meaningful way, and use the appropriate subject matter expertise and professional experience to solve problems at your organization. And then for some general important notes, language revitalization is more important than you think. It's the ultimate act of reconciliation because Anishinaabemowin, Nehiawewin, and other Indigenous languages are the history of how to live well of our peoples. It contains all of our knowledge. One example is the word Giwe-Danang in Anishinaabemowin. Giwe means home, Giwe-Din means north, and Giwe-Danang means star. So the North Star is a navigational tool to get home. And all of our language is like this. And lastly, to everyone, Indigenous identity fraud is rampant right now. It's not unreasonable to require that an Indigenous person provide proof from their nation of their citizenship. I myself have documents directly from my nation, as well as proof of ancestry and genealogy that proves I am Anishinaabe from Wikwemikong unceded territory with maternal relations in Airland First Nation. The grand majority of Indigenous people should be able to provide this. So please make sure that you are hiring a real Indigenous person and not a pretendian, because those people are committing crime and actually should be charged. So, and there is precedent set for people being charged with a felon with significant crimes because of that by the RCMP. So, Miigwech for listening today.
Thank you so much, Kaella. Many times we hear when we're talking about truth and reconciliation, maybe the sentiment, but what can I do? Like, what can I actually do? And I think you probably just listed off 20 to 30 very specific action items for what we can do. And if our attendees today were not able to write down Kaella's response, as a reminder, the recording will be available from attending Nexus. So you'll be able to go in and be able to capture all of those really specific action items. So thank you so much for that. Sheldon, I will ask you to finish off our last question here on the roundtable. So the same thing for you as well. What step can we take as organizations, and what steps as an individual are we able to take when we are working towards reconciliation within our professions?
Thank you, Nakamik. Is my camera on? Hello?
Sorry, no, it's not, Sheldon.
Okay, must be having, it shows on here, but I'm not sure what's happening.
Okay, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, the other two panelists have said so many valuable things. And I'm simply going to add one thing for individuals. And I'll mention quickly, I went back to school when I was a bit older, 37 years old, went back to do civil engineering. And there was a total of 2 ethics courses at university when I was there. The rest, were math, science, engineering, STEM courses. There was, I would say, absolutely nothing about social issues besides the little bit we saw in the ethics courses. And there was nothing about something called positionality and who you are and how you're represented to all people affects the opportunities you might have. And I think it's something that we need to do as a society better to get people to reflect on their positionality in our society. I've thought about, I have a non-Indigenous mother and an Indigenous father. My mother was from Ontario, and I had the privilege to go to Ontario, visit Ontario many times. And that gave me certain, that's something in my background, my history, that gave me certain positionality. And I think the important thing is that for, all engineers to reflect, and all people to reflect on their positionality and how that affects their opportunities and their and others as well, and how that affects others. So I think that's one thing that individuals can do, is start to reflect on that. I think organizations can look to try to remove barriers for Indigenous employees. And I worked for a Nunatsi government for a while, and they had a leave policy there where you could hunt, you had 5 days of hunting, fishing, and gathering a year. So that was an Indigenous organization giving that to their own employees, and it was very valuable that you could have that to do, and that was something you could call in if it was a nice day and you knew the char were running that day or the salmon were coming in, then you could go and do that. So there needs to be, and I recently saw a presentation at an ACES conference by Jessica Vandenberg, who talked a lot about how employers can support Indigenous employees. And that's just one example, but we need to make sure we look at other ways to support them as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sheldon. So that does bring us to the conclusion of our roundtable. I want to say a thank you to each of the panelists